I thought I'd do what could be potentially quite a long video because I've been challenged on YouTube by somebody who said that the bombing of Dresden on the night of the 13th or the 14th of February 1945 was a war crime. But that's not really the point of the video. But it stimulated me to action because we're in a war of national survival, and that was my point. My point is, if you're in the street, somebody attacks you, and you know they're going to try and kill you, and you fight back, and you end up killing them, that's not a crime, that's self-defense. The government might disagree, the CPS might disagree, but morally, no, you're in the right there. The bombing of Dresden, clearly, it was called for by Stalin at Yalta. It was a justified military target to stop German reinforcements coming eastward to help out in Silesia, to perhaps relieve Breslau, places like this. And look, I've had relatives, my in-laws, you know, at least one of them that fled through Dresden Hauptbahnhof a couple of days before the bombing. So I'm not coming from the point of view of hating Germans. I love Germany. I've been to Dresden. But it wasn't a war crime. It was a justified military target. But the person challenged me. They said at no point in either of the world wars was Britain ever threatened with national survival. And I completely disagree. We could go into what would have happened if Germany had successfully invaded the UK, which obviously they wanted to do, and we'd have just been made a puppet state like France. All the males of working age would have been deported, any Jews to be found, not that there were that many, I forget the figures, maybe 100 or 200,000. We know what happened to the 3 Jews of the Channel Islands. They were murdered with the collaboration of the police there. And of course, they would have been murdered in the UK. There was clearly a death list for other sort of prominent figures that would have, again, been executed. And ultimately, there would have been a puppet government put in place, probably. Well, we don't really need to speculate on what would have happened, but ultimately, if Britain had been knocked out of the war around that time, the consequences would have been dire. We would have been turned ultimately really into a Nazi state. The Empire would have fought on, probably with the aid of the remnants of the Royal Navy. There would have been sort of previous government pro-Nazi sort of revolts all around the empire. There'd have basically been a civil war within the British Empire, most likely. And, you know, it's very possible, we like to think that us plucky Brits would have all fought against the Germans and resisted, but we'd be no different to France, where there was a mixture in all the countries. I mean, obviously the French Empire was tiny compared with ours, but in each of them there were some generals that wanted to be liberated by the Allies, and there are quite a few who fought the Allies, and there are quite a few who collaborated with mass murder and the Holocaust. And I've no doubt it would have been the same around the British Empire in those territories that could have been successfully those that are occupied by British troops primarily. So we're thinking about places within the Middle East. We're thinking about India. You know, we're not thinking about Canada or Australia, but, you know, we're thinking about places like Palestine and stuff. Iran, Iraq. I don't know how many Jews there would have been there, but, you know, we're talking about these areas. Potentially, we know that the goal of Nazi Germany, one of the primary goals of the whole war, was the elimination of Jewry. So we're talking about dire consequences if Britain loses this war and becomes a puppet state of the Nazis. Obviously, the biggest decision was when Churchill came to power, because if it had been Lord Halifax, almost certainly a peace would have been signed. But thankfully, Halifax, in consultation with Chamberlain and Churchill, came to the conclusion, actually, Halifax wasn't really up to the job. Chamberlain was very sick at this point. I mean, he died of cancer within the year. And whereas Winston Churchill, although, you know, a very inept politician, not politician, that's the wrong word, but as First Lord of the Admiralty, in the First World War, dreadful made a lot of bad decisions in World War II, but he was never, ever, ever going to countenance peace. Now, so was it a war of national survival or not? Because that was the question. That was really I was challenged on this. At no point were we threatened. The First World War, I don't believe so. As soon as we implemented convoys, U-boats at that time were really just diving vessels. They were torpedo boats that could dive. They weren't these ocean-going vessels of the Second World War. And as soon as we implemented the convoy system, we beat them, really. But there was one point in the First World War that we could have lost and we would have had to have surrendered, and that was the Battle of Jutland. And with the inept handling by Admiral Beatty of his battle cruiser fleet, we lost tactically. Entirely his fault, in my opinion, but we won strategically. We didn't lose any dreadnoughts in that fight. However, if Admiral Scheer had beaten Jellicoe on that day, if Jellicoe had not played his card right, he played his cards right cautiously, aggressively, crossed their T twice, began to basically start smashing up the German fleet. But he was also cautious. He didn't try and chase them and completely annihilate them. He was happy with a strategic victory, and they never left port again. Had we lost that battle severely, then we would have had to have surrendered because the blockade would have been crushed by the German dreadnoughts. I believe they had about 17 dreadnoughts to our 27, but the numbers could be slightly out there, Probably sound like a buffoon compared with Drakenfeld, who, could tell me each one individually. But, we're talking about numbers such as that. But their battle cruisers were better than ours, hence why so many of ours blew up. But had we lost that, the blockade, we couldn't have supplied the army in France. We would have had to have surrendered there. And we could have just been simply blockaded. So even the First War, we could have lost if we'd have lost Jutland. It was always this cliche that a general can lose a battle but still win the war. But an admiral, as in Jellicoe, he can lose a battle and lose the whole war in one afternoon. And it was a cliche, but it was actually true. But going back to 1940, so we're thinking about the Battle of Britain going, through August into September of 1940, and we know it begins as a battle in the air. Could the Germans have won the Battle of Britain in the air? No, I don't believe they could. The reason being, although a Messerschmitt 109 is better than a Spitfire and way better than a Hurricane in every way, really. I mean, the Messerschmitt, this was a Messerschmitt E model. They had two 20mm cannon on them as well as a machine gun. You get hit by one cannon shell and it smashes up your plane. We had 8 303s. Do you see the size of a 303 bullet? The cartridge looks big. The actual projectile's tiny. You had to really put them in the right place and pump in a lot of them. And we had something like 11 seconds of firing time. They had more like, I don't know, I forget now. It was something like 30 seconds. They had way more firing time in those guns, obviously not firing as rapidly, but they're much more heavily armed. They had fuel injection engines, 109, so they climbed higher. They could dive, whereas if we dived into zero gravity, the carburetor would flood. So you could basically be bounced by a 109, could shoot at you, and then be away with a dive. You try and dive after it, your engine coughs, splutters, belches black smoke, and before you know it, it's gone. So we were at a severe disadvantage. So why do I say we couldn't lose that? The reason was that every single pilot shot down was either killed or captured, or fell over the channel and very unlikely to be rescued, although some were, of course. And that was really the difference. Plus, we could fly multiple sorties a day because we're taking off from our own airfields. And we had a very good rotation system of our pilots. And we had much higher aircraft production than the Germans. It was really the pilot training system, but we were giving them time on type of aircraft elsewhere in the quiet sectors before they are moved down into the southeast to actually fight real battles with Germans. So this rotation system, whereas the Germans were being worked to exhaustion, even though they were only flying probably one sortie a day, we were flying multiple sorties. This rotation system was being used, and indeed that's something we'd learned from the First World War, even with our troops. The French were always saying, why is it you only make them fight at the front for 7 days? Because what we would do, you'd fight 7 days in the front line, 7 days in the second line, 7 days in the third line, 7 days rest behind the lines. And it was rotation, whereas the French really didn't do that, or to a very small degree. And it's my belief that's one of the reasons why the mutinies broke out after Nivelle offensives in sort of April, May 1917. But that's another story for another day. But so was it possible to win in 1940? No. I don't believe Operation Seelöwen, Sea Lion, had any chance of success. Why would I say that? Well, let's say for argument's sake that the Germans had won the aerial battle. Possible. Improbable, but I guess it was possible. What then? Well, we still have the largest navy in the world, but it's scattered about the world, obviously. What were our plans? Well, after the Norwegian campaign, although we had to evacuate the soldiers, we had sunk a large number of German. They had very few destroyers anyway, but I think we sunk 8 of them, if I got that right, in the Second Battle of Narvik, when we sent Warspite down the fjord there. Queen Elizabeth class battleship against a destroyer. Multiple destroyers. Just smashed everything up, obviously. And so we had 80 destroyers in home waters. We had about 180 in total scattered about the world, but we had about 80 in the home waters, along with numerous light cruisers, which we were planning to use. Not obviously in the channel where they were in danger, but close enough to come to the rescue within a day or two. The Germans had 6 destroyers. And of course, they had no transport craft capable of taking the army across the channel. We know that they are arranging sort of Rhine barges and things like this, the plan being that they still had horse-drawn barges. They had some that were moving under their own steam, but a lot of them were still horse-drawn. So the plan was that one that was powered would tow 2 barges from like the River Rhine or any other, rivers or canals, which there are many in Germany. Powered one would tow 2 unpowered. And the Navy was getting this ready, but they'd already told Hitler, this is never going to work. And indeed, it wouldn't have worked, because what would have happened? They could have power dropped us, but, how many divisions do they have? 1 or 2. And, that's not going to work. The problem is, even if you do, power drop us like they did in Crete, they're very lightly armed troops. They can't bring in heavy weapons. You can't power drop a tank. So, and, they would have been overwhelmed very quickly. In practice, what would have happened had they attempted Sea Lion, even if they'd have had, let's say they had obtained air superiority or even air supremacy over the southeast of England, the plan was always this. If we just can't hold against them in the southeast, what we'll do, we'll just keep our fighters back, we'll replenish them, sort of churn them out so fast, give our pilots some practice. And so the moment the invasion started, there would certainly have been a massive air battle anyway, because suddenly they would have been attacked, even if they thought the Royal Navy, the RAF, I should say, had been defeated. There would have been a massive air battle over the channel, trying to attack these barges and so on. And we still had a fairly strong bomber force as well. And what would happen then? Let's say they managed to get a fair few troops over, a first wave, because they certainly didn't have enough to bring over many divisions. They'd have to tow back these barges and brought over more troops. Let's say they managed that. Indeed, that's what happened when they war gamed it in 1974 with Adolf Galland playing Goering, and they had, some German generals, British generals, they war gamed it. They did achieve a landing. But then the problem is that by this point, the Royal Navy, which has been kind of hiding out of sight, just nearby, but not near enough so they could be air attacked. Suddenly, we would obviously have gone in with everything that we had, as I say, all those 80 destroyers. I don't know precisely how many light cruisers we had, but we're probably talking a couple of dozen. And not only would the troops on the landing beaches probably have been checked there and then, but they would suffer bombardment from the sea. And all of those landing craft, if you want to call them that, those barges that they were towing over, they would have all been destroyed. We'd have suffered a lot of losses to air attack, but the Royal just had so many destroyers and cruisers that there was no way they could support them. I mean, the logistics you require, imagine how many ships, can you even fit a tank on a Rhine barge? I don't think you could. Pretty sink the barge, wouldn't it? It was just totally unworkable and unfeasible. And that's what the Navy said from the start, because of the power of the Royal Navy. Had it not been for the Royal Navy, yes, Britain could have been invaded in 1940. So it was never going to happen, that invasion. Had it happened, it would have been a bloodbath. And that was what the war game said. Yeah, they managed to land, but they all got destroyed, even trying to return to collect more troops. And yeah, the Royal Navy did suffer quite a few losses, but yeah, it was a no-goer. So yeah, I agree. 1940, zero chance of invasion. The only chance really would have been, as I said before previously, if someone other than Churchill had come to power, and that was Chamberlain's last great deed before he fell so sick, that he supported Churchill, and it was great that Lord Halifax did again realise he wasn't the man, and he backed Churchill because Churchill was considered something of an outsider, and he's always said he had this manifest destiny, and I guess he did. So for all his flaws, he's probably the reason why we didn't just make a negotiated peace. And so that was the best chance. Their other chance, of course, was once they'd established. A seaborne invasion, never going to work with the power of the Royal Navy. No chance. The other possibility was southeast England. Let's say they did establish air supremacy. Anything that goes near there is getting shot down. The airfield's been shot to pieces, bombed to bits. Terror bombing. They just completely unchecked bombing night and day of London. Would that have caused Britain to capitulate? Well, it never caused the Germans to capitulate. And Goering, of course, famously said, when somebody said, "Yeah, we're going to smash up London, and then they're going to surrender, those British." And Goering turned in contempt to that. I can't remember who it was that said that to him, but he turned in contempt and he said, "Okay, so if the British destroy Berlin, are we gonna surrender?" And they're like, "No, obviously not." And he said, "Why do you think the British are any different?" And so I think that's right. And let's be honest, the heart of our industry was not London, it was the Midlands. So, again, I don't think terror bombing would have worked as a strategy. I really can't see... Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention as well, when that landing occurred, again, this is a fight to the death. This is not fighting in France, fighting in Norway, fighting in Belgium. This is Britain. This is defending the heart of an empire at the time. So we had tons of mustard gas we were going to drop on them. So it would not... We never used chemical weapons in World War II, but we would have done. It was already... had they landed, those beaches would have been deluged in mustard gas. And if you know one thing about mustard gas, it lingers. If you study a bit of World War I, it doesn't just blow away and then it's gone. It lingers for years. There were places that they had to have massive cleanup crews to make places safe. It was considered after the First World War, when it finally ended, that the Belgian government actually wanted to abandon the whole territory of Ypres and just grow a big forest there, because many agriculturalists and such people said everywhere's just too poisoned. So mustard gas does linger. And so deluging the landing beaches with that. And there are a variety of all sorts of other contraptions that have been set up. But I think the chemical weapons would have also been decisive. However, that said, we do know that one of Fritz Haber, lovely gentleman, watch my video on him, or his wife rather, lovely gentleman, Fritz Haber, invented gas warfare. One of his PhD students, I think it was, did invent Tabun, which is obviously taboo in German, which was organophosphate. And so, had we dropped mustard gas, they had over a ton of tabun. So they would have probably, in retaliation, used organophosphates on us. And they didn't have vast stockpiles, but then you don't need vast stockpiles. It's incredibly deadly. So, possibly if we would have used chemical weapons for sure. We didn't know they had worse ones. We didn't really have a defense against it. There are defenses against it, but it's just a powerful anticholinergic, and you're just it's going to cause you to convulse and die, probably break your own neck, that kind of thing. Pretty unpleasant. That might, but again, it wouldn't have changed things. They didn't have enough of that, but it would have inflicted vast casualties had they used it, and pretty horrible deaths for a lot of soldiers and civilians. But it would have failed. So why do I say it was a war of national survival then, if there was no chance we could be invaded and very little chance we could lose unless there was a political capitulation? The reason why I say that is, if it wasn't for Hitler being so keen to invade Russia, he really wanted to go east for all sorts of reasons, for the elimination of Jews, for conquering of Lebensraum in the east, for just wanting to defeat Bolshevism, as he called it. If he'd have just been more patient, if he'd have thought we really have to defeat Britain first, and just waited another year, and not been so keen to attack Russia, because obviously, 22nd of June, he invades Russia. Had Germany built up its strength, had all the manpower resources, and let's be honest, they captured many French soldiers. They didn't return them even when Vichy collaborated under Pétain. They were using them for slave labour. They had vast industrial potential, more than we did, although slave labour doesn't tend to work very efficiently. But they had the whole of Europe at their disposal. If they had set about a plan, rationally thinking, how can we beat Britain, and really put their minds to it, I think they could have done, probably within a year. And the main way I see them doing that was by U-boats. They just had so few in 1940 that, although they were inflicting heavy losses, we had a merchant marine of about 3,000 ships, something like that. And they were sinking, the height 40 a month later on in the war. If they had set about building U-boats at a very fast rate, I don't think there's a lot we could have done about it, really, because at that point we were sinking very few U-boats and we really didn't have much defence. So it's really the U-boat campaign. And let's not forget, it's not the Battle of the Atlantic, it's the War of the Atlantic. It goes on, even into 1943, we're still suffering heavy losses, despite having the advantage of reading German maritime codes, trying to route convoys around wolf packs, having the assistance of the American Navy, the Canadian Navy, the Royal Navy. We are still suffering horrendous losses, and it takes a long time to build a ship. But, I don't know how long it takes to build a U-boat, but had they really set their mind to it, they may have been able to starve Britain simply with U-boats. But it would have taken a while. A year, I'll just pull that out of my head. Maybe it would have been 2 years, I don't know. But had they set their mind to it, a real serious U-boat campaign, that would have been an option. So that was a time. The other crucial decision was after December 7th, 1941, because let's not forget, before that, Roosevelt's support for Churchill, although Churchill liked to think that they were best mates and everything. Actually, it seems when you read Roosevelt's personal kind of recollections and stuff, he didn't really like Churchill. I believe he met him once around the time of the First World War, and he couldn't stand Churchill. And obviously they got on better, with their relationship. But and Churchill was always begging for more support, and Roosevelt was offering it. But until America came into the war, what would that have been? Something like the 10th, because, I mean, would have been, yeah, sort of, because obviously 7th of December 1941 is when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. It's about 4 days later, Hitler declares war on Germany, which is obviously crucial, absolutely crucial, because Churchill was hoping that at that point, Roosevelt will declare war on Germany, but he doesn't. He declares war on Japan, obviously. And at that point, the American army is tiny. They've got a massive job of building it up just to beat Japan. Japan is not a weak nation. Even at that time, it's not, it wasn't the economic giant, but its economy was still about half the size of Britain's even then, not including the empire, obviously, but with a vast navy. They'd gone in for carriers. I mean, did they have 8 large carriers, something like that? And, really that in itself was a very significant battle, or a war that would have that would have taken massive resources by America to beat Japan on its own. And then suddenly, Churchill's expecting Roosevelt to declare war on Germany as well. It's all part of the same axis, and he doesn't. So Hitler's decision to declare war on America, again, absolutely crucial. Now, we know that before this point, Roosevelt had agreed to extend protection of convoys to halfway across the Atlantic. And so, obviously, there were battles, there were between U-boats and between American destroyer escorts and, these things. Before that, there had been sinkings on both sides because of this idea of America protecting those convoys halfway across the Atlantic. And of course, as soon as Hitler declares war, which you'll say Hitler's a madman, but his naval commanders, like Dönitz, for example, and Admiral Raeder, they're all emphasising, look, America's already at war with us anyway. I mean, look, they're doing, they're attacking us at sea. And of course, it does give rise to the so-called Second Happy Time, where because of Americans refusing to do convoys of their own ships and, not doing blackouts and all these kinds of things, literally these sea-going U-boats that the Germans have, they're just, waiting outside New York Harbor and torpedoing ships the moment they come out silhouetted against the bright lights of New York City. So initially, it means suddenly the loss rate goes up vastly. But it was obviously a grave mistake, because suddenly you have a large industrial nation. I mean, if you look at the wartime production of America compared with Britain, it's about between 4 and 5 times as much when you look at most things. If you look at sort of tonnage of things produced. So that's what we're talking about at that point in terms of the UK mainland versus America. It's a crucial decision. There was no guarantee that America would declare war on Germany, at least no time soon. And so that was a point where, again, had that declaration of war not been made somewhat rashly, but under the advice of his military advisors, which he was still taking at that time very much. It was only at the end when he started losing trust in his advisors. I still believe that the U-boat campaign against us could well have been successful. So, unfortunately, whoever said it wasn't a war of national survival, either World War I or World War II, they obviously are looking at it with the benefit of hindsight. Yes, we won. We won both wars. Great. But at the time, no one knew we were going to win. And certainly World War I, okay, the only time we could have lost it was Jutland. Or if the Germans had tried again and there was a second Jutland or whatever, they might have won the second time after, the first one, tactical victory for them, strategic victory for us. Whatever, they didn't try again. Certainly in France, there was every chance we could have been beaten. With Operation Mica, we were getting rolled back pretty badly in the spring of 1918. And there was every chance, the junction at Amiens, if Amiens had been taken, suddenly we lose our crucial rail hub. there were definitely possibilities of the British and the French armies being split. And of course, it was in that moment of panic that finally we had a unified command with Foch in charge, and the British and the French worked more, closely together to check that advance and ultimately roll it back. And then, towards the end, we have the so-called 100 Days, where primarily the British, with their combined arms offensive, finally defeat the Germans. But there was every possibility that that operation could have been successful, broke through, rolled us back dozens of miles, and yeah, we could easily have made a negotiated peace at that point if we'd have been kicked off the continent, like we were, like what happened in the Second World War. So no, there are opportunities in both worlds. It's too easy with history to just say, yeah, there's absolutely no chance of winning. But there were opportunities to win. Just to leave those for now, if you look at the American Civil War, if you look at it on paper, you think, well, the American North has, 10 times the industrial capacity of the South, the Confederate States, and these kinds of things. But then, actually, when you look at the political situation, again, there was every chance of the Confederates winning. It came very close to Britain actually acknowledging the Confederacy as being a legitimate nation. It was, it's... And also, the Confederacy, they didn't have to win. All they had to do was not lose, which is very important in that case. And it was a war the Confederacy certainly could have won. It's been a while since I studied that, so I'm not going to go into specifics, if I can even say the word, because I may get that wrong. But there were several opportunities where even there, a massively greater power on paper could have lost to a weaker one. And certainly in the case of Britain against Germany, we're talking about really, okay, if you consider the empire maybe not weaker, certainly consider the navy, ours was far stronger. But if you look at the power that Germany had, I just think if Hitler had been less impatient, he could have invaded Britain, or at least starved Britain first. And as I say, and then we would have fought on from Canada or whatever. And it would have been quite dark days, I think, if we'd have had Oswald Mosley as the Prime Minister or whatever. Not very good. But yes, it's just one of these things. Never look at history as a clear-cut thing. When you study it, there's so much contingency for different things to happen.